So good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see everyone again. And I'm going to ask people to please mute themselves because otherwise we'll get extraneous noises. Thank you. And I know our speakers don't need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. So today we're going to be speaking about reimagining Judaism in 60 minutes or less. Conversation with Rabbi Hara and Amy Asen. So Hara, as you know, is the chief executive of the CCAR. She was previously its chief strategy officer. And in that capacity, she oversaw the communications department and served as publisher of the CCAR Press and put out some wonderful, wonderful books. And she was ordained in 1998 after graduating summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Amherst College. And she also received an MA in Fine Arts from NYU. She served as educator at the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue from 1990 to 1996. And she was the adjunct rabbi there from 1998 to 2019. Since 1998, she's been the High Holiday Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Olam in Fire Island. And as you probably know as well, before coming to the CCAR, she was the editor-in-chief of the URJ Books and Music, and she was responsible for the revision of the Torah, a modern commentary, and the publication of many significant projects. And she's also written some books, and you can find her resume on the website of the CCAR. She also has it says two young adults. I don't know how young they are, but as children, they're her children. She lives in Brooklyn. And Amy Asen is the Vice President of Strengthening Congregation. And she leads the URJ's initiatives in strengthening congregations, one of 4 priorities of the URJ's 2020 vision. She's guiding initiatives in leadership development, congregational innovation, congregational networking, and transition and crisis management. She's a thought leader and frequent speaker in the area of congregational life, and she's published articles in various media outlets including E-Jewish Philanthropy. Prior to the URJ, Amy consulted to congregations and the organizations that support them on strategic planning and organizational transformation. She was a longtime senior advisor to the experiment in congregational education. And some of her clients were the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the URJ, Hebrew Union College, the San Francisco Bureau of Jewish Education, and a number of individual congregations. And prior to this professional work in the Jewish community, Amy worked as a corporate strategy and organization consultant as a principal with Booz Allen and Hamilton in New York and San Francisco. She has an MBA with distinction from Harvard Business School and a BA in economics with high honors from Princeton University. She lives in Palo Alto, and she also has 2 adult children. So the way we're going to do this today is that both Hara and Amy are going to give us each a 5-minute presentation, and the rest of the hour is going to be a Q&A. So Amy or Hara, who's starting? Hara, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, my kids would probably no longer appreciate being called young adults, so I think I have to update that. But anyway, I think it's quite a question, and it's actually sort of amazing, hubris on our part to really predict what's coming, because how do we know? And nobody really knows what's coming, or what Judaism is going to be. But I think that there are some lessons that we're learning and have learned in this past year that will inform what's coming next and how we operate next. And of course, I know we all know this, but I'll just say it anyway, which is, the changes that we're in the middle of are changes that were happening anyway. And this year kind of accelerated, but certainly the changes were brewing under the surface anyway. And the questions for us, of course, is, how are we going to meet these changes going forward? What do we do with them? So what I can share with you is not a roadmap, but just some thoughts and some questions that are on my mind and are in conversations with other people, including many of you. I think one of the things that we have learned this year and are continuing to learn is that actually can meet needs in ways that we thought previously we couldn't. And that's a wonderful thing. And it's also a huge challenge for the future. So, what I mean by that is, I remember when I was in rabbinic school, I worked for the outreach department. I worked for Drew Greenwood, those of you who remember Drew and remember the outreach department. And, there was this kind of mantra at the time that, like, oh, you can't go to Judaism online. Like, there are all of these reasons why you can't do it. And, we kind of built a system around that. And that's just one example of so many kind of conversations that we've had over the years, right? So, like, you can't do religious school online. But then what happens when you're suddenly thrown into an environment in which you have to do everything online, and suddenly you're doing the very things that you said you could never do and would never work? And so I think one of the things that we take from that is like, okay, actually, maybe it can work, and maybe it's actually a good thing, and maybe now we can reach people we haven't been able to reach. And all those people who couldn't get to synagogue, suddenly we're reaching them. And so how are we now? We're not going to just go back and say, okay, it's been nice for this year and a half, or whatever it's going to be, and now we can't meet those needs any longer. So actually, you are going to have to get in your car and drive 2 hours to get your kids to religious school on Wednesday afternoon, or they can't participate in the program. Like, now we actually see that there can be other ways to do this. So that's good. I think that's good for all of us. I think it really challenges us to figure out, okay, there are other ways that we can operate, and maybe we really can expand who we are as a community and the ways that we can meet needs that we haven't been able to meet before. I think that's exciting. And I'm not talking about a sort of, continuing in a completely online environment, but there are pieces of this that I think we can figure out how we're going to live with longer term, and sort of invite more people into the community in a way that they might not have been able to participate before. So I think that that's one of the things. I think that we are going to have a sort of continuing challenge about how we define who we are. So what does it mean to be a Reform Jew? What does it mean to be part of the Reform movement? What does it mean to be a Reform rabbi, or a Reform congregation, or a Reform institution? I think those are big questions for us that we really have to think about in a sort of new way. We need to really be able to articulate what those things mean, why they're sources of pride for us, and why they define what we're about in a sort of exciting and compelling way that actually makes sense. I think one of the interesting things also of this time has been people finding us, right? So, like, services so widely available on Facebook or on YouTube or on so many other platforms is great, and also requires a greater definition about what it is that we're actually doing and who we are in doing it. And I think that that's really true for rabbis. Again, this has been happening. It's not a new question, but what is the future of the rabbinate? How do we really articulate what it means to be a member of the CCAR, to have the credentials of being a member of the CCAR, not just sort of a rabbi out there, right? We all know that there's this kind of growing issue about different rabbis without credentials that we might feel are appropriate. That's going to be an ever greater for us to really be able to define and be able to say kind of loudly in the market ideas like, this is who we are, this is what we're about, this is why it matters. And we know that challenge isn't going away anytime soon. So that's going to be something we're really focusing on a lot. And I think we're also coming out of the pandemic as and when we really are. I think that there's going to be a lot of focus we need to do at the CCR on not just sort of skill set building, which is definitely a piece, and not just the sort of Torah Lishma that, you know, we always need to be doing as rabbis, but also how do we really focus on rabbinic wellness? How do we, what are we going to do to help rabbis heal so that they can help communities heal? How do we achieve and really emphasize the importance of wellness? What do rabbis need in order to have not just the sort of skill set, but the, I don't know, the right place in their heart and in their soul to do the work that has to be done for their communities, for the communities that they serve. So there's going to be, at least for us at the CCR, a real emphasis on this idea of rabbinic wellness and taking care of ourselves, taking care of each other, and take care of the people out there who are counting on us. And what does that look like for the Jewish community? You know, I think one of the big questions of the next years is going to be, you know, sort of the sustainability of what a rabbinic job looks like. You know, how do we balance what is expected of a rabbi with also the need to practice self-care, to be as strong as possible internally, again, so that we can take care of the community that's counting on us. So those are all among the questions. I mean, those are really big questions. I don't have easy answers or solutions for any of that, but I do think we're at a really interesting change moment with that is opening up space to have conversations that there wasn't necessarily room for in the past. And that to me is an exciting moment, that we can really focus on, you know, how do we create strong communities? What is to be a community? Like, let's really look at those definitions. And we don't have to be reliant on the terms and the frameworks that we've used up to this point. And, you know, it's a moment for sort of pause and change and reflection that I think is really positive as we build what's coming next. So I'll stop there, and obviously a lot more to talk about.
Thank you, Hara. I like the positive spin. Amy.
Thanks, and it's really great to be here with you at PARR. It's been a couple of years since I was able to make it to Palm Springs, so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here virtually with all of you. I'm gonna share my screen. I've got a little PowerPoint that I put together, and as I started to think about kind of what we're really talking about, we're in this moment of on the precipice of returning, and we've been talking for a while about not returning to where we were, and so in some ways I feel like we are returning to our future, which is a strange way of really thinking about it. It's a contradictory phrase, but in some ways I think that's actually what we're doing. And to the extent that we can be thinking about this as returning to our future as opposed to returning to our past, I think we're going to be more successful. This is a framework that I hope that many of you are familiar with already. This is comes from an article that Rabbi Esther Letterman and I co-authored about the 5 shifts that congregations need to make. And as Hara mentioned, we wrote this, I think it was published in February of 2020, but it comes from work that was done and presented at the biennial in December of 2019. The things that I'm talking about here are things that were present before the pandemic and have been accelerated by the pandemic. And so just to go through some highlights, and part of the reason I want to highlight these is I'm going to be reviewing this at a somewhat level. We'll be teaching this at the Scheit seminar in 2 weeks. And so if you are a congregational rabbi who is sending your president to the Scheit seminar, it also gives you a sense of some of the content that they're going to see. This is the first piece is probably the biggest shift that we are really talking about right now. What is the Jewish community that we're trying to build, as opposed to being caretakers of the Jewish community that we've had? And to the extent that we can deal with what has been framed as an innovator's dilemma, how do we caretake the people who are already in our congregations, our donors, and those people who show up every week? We've got to serve them. And yet at the same time, if all we do is serve them, we're going to be in a downward spiral towards the end of at least Reform congregational life. That doesn't mean that Reform Judaism will come to an end, but congregational life, I believe, will. And so the challenge is building for the community that we are becoming while we're ministering to the community that we already are. And there's no easy answer to that. Books have been written about it. It's something that exists in every organization, in every community. It's going to help us to the extent that we can really be in conversation with our people rather than be thinking about our institution. And that's the second shift. And I just want to give you an example. I was just prepping one of my colleagues to present at Shite, and she's going to be teaching how to ask good questions so that you can be more people-centric. And I said, well, we always start out with, how can we get more people to show up for Shabbat services? Very institution-centric question. And then we say to the person, don't be so institution-centric. And they say, oh, I've got it. How can we make sure that you have Shabbat in your life? Great question. Still not person-centric. Oh, how can we make sure that you have rest in your life? Still not person-centric. How about, what ways do you find peace? Let's have a conversation about how you find peace now and how you yearn for peace. And from there, build back to, what would it be like if 5 or 10 of you got together who were all yearning for peace and found a way to do that together? And that becomes a person-centric rather than an institution-centric way of having that conversation. We need to do more of that. I'm not going to go through all 5 of them. We can make sure you get the link to the article and read it if you haven't seen it already. But as we think about how we're going to return to our future, building the skills to do these 5 things is really important. These are the discussion questions. We're going to have the presidents go into breakout groups, just again, so that you can see what we do. We're going to ask them to think about, where are they in the process of these 5 shifts? And that's basically what these 5 questions ask them to do, and ask them to think about, what should they be doing next? I want to give you a little bit of context for the world that we're living in that I just learned about last week, and help you understand that it's more than just about us having discovered, as Hara so rightly pointed out, that we can do things that we didn't used to do online. I had the opportunity to learn with a man named Casper ter Kuile last week, and he is a Harvard Divinity School grad and has started an organization called Sacred Design Lab. He works in the field of secular spiritual communities, whatever that means. And he pointed out that there are tons of these online spiritual communities that exist right now that are engaging tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. They're using new technologies. How many of you have heard of Patreon, for example? Patreon. There are 15 rabbis I just Googled it. There are 15 rabbis on Patreon offering subscription services to their stuff. You can have a Patreon subscription to a rabbi. And you can have a Patreon subscription to lots and lots of other spiritual type people. These spiritual communities are also creating engagement pathways so that maybe you pay $5 a month to get a drash, but then you want to do something bigger and eventually you want to actually meet in person. And they bill themselves as the nicest corner of the internet. The other big trend that Casper pointed out was spirituality in the workplace, especially during COVID. This has really accelerated. Corporations are training their managers as pastoral care counselors. They're literally doing this. How does a manager do active listening? How does a manager help an employee find resources? How does a manager sit and listen and provide the space for an employee to share with them the challenges that they're facing in their day? They're trying to address loneliness. They're trying to create relationships. And by the way, as a business, they're trying to create ways for people across the organization to get to know each other. So there's self-interest in it. It's not just about just, providing this nice, good space, but the congregants that you have in your congregations and the participants that you wish you had are experiencing this at work in bigger and bigger numbers, which then begs the question, how does the congregation, what is the value that the congregation is providing in that space? And here are just a couple of examples. If you want to go and take a look at them, there's an organization called Medley. Basically puts you together in a small group, coaching group, and there's a spiritual element to it. The Inter NBA, this is a LinkedIn project in collaboration with New York University. Jack Kornfield, there he is, spiritual guru. There's a spiritual component to it. And there are lots of primarily non-Christian, non-Jewish communities that are starting to exist, online spiritual communities. And these are some of the ones that are out there. So my challenge to us is to really ask two big questions. Everybody says, we need a strategic plan for our congregation. I would argue that there are really only two strategic questions that we need to answer. Everything else is interesting and important, but it's not strategic. If you're not addressing these, you're not really doing strategy. One of them is, to what extent are you willing to reallocate resources from that base that you're serving today really to a new audience that's not paying yet? To that myriad of people out there, the people who are logging on to your Shabbat service, you don't even know what city they're in. And to what extent are you willing to challenge the idea that your building is an asset? Those are the two big strategic questions. And then for you, I have a bonus question, which is, how will this impact the role of the rabbi? How will this impact you as a leader? How will this impact you as a professional? How will this impact you as a human? How will this impact you and the aspirations that you have for your rabbinate? And with that, I'll turn it back to Suzanne.
I turned off my microphone. Yes, thank you, Howard, for, I said, thank you, Amy. Those are such important questions that we need to ask. And we need the partnership of our board to agree that these are what we need to ask ourselves. So I am going to open it up to questions now. And I may take the privilege of being the host here to ask the first one, and then other people, please feel free to, just unmute and ask a question or raise your hand or whatever. So Hara, I know you don't have the answers, but when you're saying we need to sort of redefine what it means to be a Reformed Jew, can you give us some thoughts about what you're thinking of, how we would define that?
Yeah, and Amy, I love that. Thank you so much for framing those ideas. I think that I guess it feels to me like this is a time for some precision in our articulations. That I think maybe for a long time it's been kind of easy to just let that exterior frameworks define who we are and who our institutions are. But I think one of the things that this year has done is it's blurred a lot of boundaries, and not necessarily in a bad way. But it is now a moment for us to figure out how to really articulate in a new way what it means when we say we're a Reform rabbi or we're a Reform community. Like, let's really get down deep into what that means. And it's not just enough to say, well, Isaac Mayer Wise did this and then this and then this, but like on a deep level, on a spiritual level, on a values level, on a Torah level, what does it mean? How do we read Torah? What's unique that we bring to it as Reform rabbis? What's unique about the way that we might preach or speak? What's unique about the way we act in the world as Reform rabbis? Like we need to really be able to articulate that. And it's not just about, the platform of this or that, but what does it mean for each one of us that ties into, yes, into our history, it needs to, but it also has to be about how we're looking toward the future, and what do we uniquely bring to that as Reform rabbis. And it's not necessarily going to be the same answer for each one of us, but I think that we need to each find greater precision in language in the way that we're articulating that.
Okay,
And
thank you. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Please.
Wendy, I'm going to get to you in 1 second, but Lisa put a question in the chat that I'd like to pose for her. What we do not know about any of these new models is longevity. Which will be there in 5 years? What will build the door vador for relationships serving families, not just individuals? And I take it that's probably for Amy.
I agree that we don't know. I wish that we knew. What I can tell you is that what we're seeing, on one hand, the models that are gaining traction are the models that really speak to the individual, not the individual as an individual. And I want to speak to the notion of individualism versus community. I really think that that's important. And I think that one of our values as Reform Jews is that community is important. One of our values in Judaism is that we confront the other. You can't be holy by yourself. But I think that the models that are gaining traction really speak to the yearnings of the individual and then put them in community with people who have similar yearnings. And so I would challenge us to start, again, being person-centric and asking that question. On the other hand, I think there's a really interesting thing that's happening around the cost structure of all of these organizations and how they are shedding buildings, how they are shedding some of the things that create a lot of overhead for us. And I would imagine that a lot of these people who are doing these things are serious risk takers and willing to go about launching and working in these new models without knowing the answer to your question. And I think that's, I'm not one of those people. I work for a big institution. But I think that's some of what we're seeing.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Stan Davids, and after him, Michael Kahan, and then Michelle Masagia, and then Paul Kibness. Remember that order. Stan?
Okay, thank you. First of all, Hara, Amy, thank you so very much. We are, I think, brilliantly served. And this is not easy for me to say. I'd much rather be critical, but we are brilliantly served. And thank you for the work that you're both doing. I have a small question just off to the side. We have the union and the conference, and yet it seemed appropriate not to have included an invitation to the college simultaneously. That troubled me from the moment I looked at the program. The suggestions that Hara made, Amy made regarding moving toward the future were all suggestions that dealt with fixing the status quo. And it's my impression that the status quo, and Hara said this right at the beginning, change was already underway before COVID came. The status quo is not, from my perspective, sustainable. Religious institutions, liberal religious institutions, are shrinking dramatically. To assume that a heritage institution like the Union can significantly reform itself from within seems to be a very challenging belief. The whole notion of what membership in a synagogue might mean, or Hara's comments, what are Reform rabbis supposed to be doing in this changing world, is a lot larger than the questions you both addressed. And thus the question, where is our movement significantly investing resources in a world which is not waiting for slow-paced institutional change, which won't help anyway because the world is changing faster?
Amy, I think that one's for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. And I love the challenge because the challenge to the URJ is the same challenge that I posed to you, right? I said, it's really hard to satisfy your current base and build for the future at the same time. One of the ways that you do that is to build a relationship with your current base that allows you to experiment in things that aren't for them. And the question is, at what point do they see that as a threat versus they see that as something that will eventually benefit them? And so as the URJ begins to experiment with bringing more and more people into Reform Judaism to really expand the pipeline, to help people connect before they join a congregation. We are starting to do those things. We have an experiment right now going on called RJ on the Go, for example, and we are prepared to begin launching more and more experiments. There's an experiment that we're testing in the Philadelphia area to connect preschool families to Jewish camping in the hope that it will deepen their connection so that eventually they will land in a congregation or do something else. Lots and lots of those kinds of experiments. The challenge is, how do we, as we do that, support our congregations? How do we balance our resources so that we're still helping our congregations be the best they can be or be the next thing that they need to be as we work on those other experiments? How do we bring the 550,000 people who we engaged in civic engagement into whatever the next thing is that they ought to be doing? How do we take the 12 million people who log into our website every year and find the next thing for them so that they can be on a pathway towards deeper engagement? Those are the questions we're asking, and it takes resources away from you.
Thanks, Amy.
Be honest about that. That's, I'll end.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody who's engaged. Amy, I want to continue this path that you're challenging us with. And, full disclosure, I'm rabbi of a historic congregation blessed with a very beautiful building. And I do want to push back a little bit on this assumption about buildings, which I probably felt more strongly about before pandemic. One of the things that I've been fascinated about during this period of time, the thing that I hear the most from people is how much they miss being in that space that inspires them. It's partly, I understand, being out of our homes, but I would have thought that the conversation that I would hear would be a lot about how we miss being together, about how we miss, all of the things that I think that we talk about that's so meaningful to us. But the space carries great meaning for people. There's something about awe. There's something about sacredness. And I think this is something that can't be reproduced on Zoom. So I wonder if you think that there are, if you are hearing this from other people, maybe it's just my own experience. I understand these are the people we already have rather than the people we don't have. I get all of that. But I just wonder if some of the assumptions we had before pandemic need to be a little bit challenged from the experiences we've had over this past year.
Yeah, I love the question. And I really appreciate the fact that you've taken away the easy answer, right? Because the easy answer is the answer that was typed into the chat, which was, yeah, but those are just our people who are already in the system. Of course, they yearn for the building. So the hard question then is, how do we think of the building differently? What does it mean to gather together in physical space? How is it different than just, okay, that's the sanctuary, we use it on Friday nights, or the social hall? In other words, what is the purpose of our space? And what's the purpose of being together? And does being together require the building? Like, even being together physically, does it require the building? Does the building require the things that we used to do in them? What does it mean to experience awe because of a particular physical space? So I don't think we should be building a lot of new buildings, but that doesn't mean that there's not a role for them to play. It probably wouldn't be the first card that I would put on the table. You know, I would probably look to build on the online and the virtual and the ability to reach more people first, and ask the question, what really benefits from being in person in the building? As opposed to what we used to do, which was, okay, everything's in the building, what could we do online? I think we have to flip that question.
Great. Michelle.
Great, I like that, thank you. I wanted to go back to something that Hara brought up, which was that we really need to look at ourselves as Reformed Jews and think about what we in particular can offer that is unique as Reformed Jews. I don't know if this is just who I am, or if it's also a combination of that and what I see and experience out there, but I don't really, forgive me, I don't think most people give a hoot about reform, conservative, recon, or if I don't think they really care about that. And I'm proud I'm a Reform rabbi, but I don't really care about that. I care about engaging Jews. That's why every time I convert someone, I convert them with a reform conservative and reconstructionist and Beit Din. I don't convert people to reform because they're just Jewish. And so I'm wondering if this whole pandemic also has shown us that that's not what's important. What's important is engaging, and each of our communities can engage people with different gifts and with different things, but I'm not sure the reform mantle and tooting that is really so engaging and exciting and interesting to most people anymore. And I just wondered, Hara, if you want to argue with me or push back or take that challenge.
I would love to respond to it. I'm not going to argue with you because I think you're right. But so what I'm talking about is not sort of, yeah, I mean, I'm having a hard time articulating this, but I think it's for ourselves that it's important for us to understand what unique value we bring as Reform rabbis. It's not so much like what's on your calling card, so to speak. Who has a calling card, but right. But it's and I agree, like we're not, converting people into Reform Judaism. But I do think that as Reform Jews and as the Reform movement, we have certain strengths and we have certain unique features of our makeup. And it doesn't mean we don't learn from a wider circle and from our non-Reform colleagues and are enriched by that and so on. I don't mean that. But but there is a uniqueness to who we are and what we bring that I think we ourselves need to understand better. And at the same time, so, you know, there, at one moment in the pandemic, I got this very like dramatic email from a federation director, not in California, right? Somewhere else in the country, basically demanding from me and from a few of our other leaders that like we mandate that people can know that our rabbis can no longer lead services that are open to the public, because it's a terrible thing for local congregations because people are flocking to, you know, the big production kind of services. And it's destroying local communities. And I just, obviously I did not, you know, do what he was asking, but it did make me reflect on, okay, so, you know, if everything is kind of open and you can just see it on Facebook and on whatever, you're going to get to see a lot of really interesting and beautiful things, very different from each other all around. And maybe some people are just, you know, maybe somebody in Chicago is just going to decide that Central Synagogue is where they want to go to services every week because that music is spectacular and whatever. But that doesn't, that's one kind of experience. But then there's the in-person, or well, okay, so not in person, but there's the person to person, let's say, value of relationship. And that's, I think, the, you know, part of the unique value that we bring in local communities, right? And so it doesn't matter what amazing service Central Synagogue is doing or, you know, wherever. But the work that you are doing on the ground in your communities, as you know, the all the rich gifts that you yourself bring, right? That's sort of part, that's the, you know, unique value proposition, right? Part of that is being a Reform rabbi enriched by our Reform history and our Reform future. Like, what questions are we asking as Reform Jews? What challenges are we grappling with as Reform rabbis that we bring uniquely to the relationships with the people we serve? Does that make any more sense, Michelle?
Yeah, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure we really have any unique questions that many of the other liberal movements aren't also asking.
Okay, fair enough. But I think we need to be able to articulate those and really bring them forward and have courage in saying this is where we are, this is where we've gotten to, and this is what we're thinking about. This is, you know.
So let me ask our two speakers, Hara and Amy. There are a number of people who want to ask questions. Can you stay a little bit later?
A little bit.
15
Yeah,
minutes?
a little bit.
15 minutes?
My next appointment is actually one of the people who's attending the session, so we can get her permission for us.
Okay, permission, please, for 15 more minutes. Aaron, are you still there?
I am. Thank you. So I'm an interloper to PARR, sort of a PARR wannabe. And so I come to these occasionally because they're very valuable for me. And my question I actually put into the chat, and I've written about it. So I appreciate the opportunity, Amy, to hear your thoughts about the URJ's willingness to challenge its own assumptions and encourage its member congregations. I wonder what will be taught at Shite to talk to our neighbors. It seems to me that every congregation, essentially, certainly I'm speaking from my own in Pittsburgh, confronts challenges that are very similar: budgets, property, program, board leadership, membership. But there's no encouragement, as far as I can tell, for any congregation to speak to any other congregation. I wonder how many of us, our board members, have their counterparts in the neighboring congregation on their speed dial, or how often they speak to them, or when a SWOT analysis is taking place or a search is taking place, speaking to neighbors. Because I think all of the change rhetoric is fascinating and really interesting theory, but I believe that if every congregation goes it alone, it's a war of attrition. It's just a fight to the death. And I wonder if the URJ is willing to encourage us to talk to each other.
Yeah, Aaron, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's a pretty central message that we do talk about a lot. I didn't raise it today. We get a lot of requests from congregational leaders as they enter into anything from just low-level collaboration agreements all the way up to pre-merger and merger conversations. David Fine, who's on the call, has developed actually quite a lot of expertise, and the URJ is blessed to have him and the resources that he's created to help congregations through those moments. And if you are in conversation with the congregation next door around that, and want to bring us in to help facilitate that, we would be excited to be part of that. The other thing that's happening now that I'm excited about is the organic collaboration that's happening in the movement. I know there are, for example, are several efforts across North America to bring congregations together for Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We don't have to be the people who convene all the time. There are lots of great rabbis out there who are bringing groups of congregations together. That's just an example. Instead of it just being, where I live, Palo Alto congregations to get together for Shavuot, now it can be congregations across the Pacific time zone, so on and so forth. We're also in conversation, and Hara, I don't know if you're going to be at this meeting, but I know that I'll be there with Leora Kay and Betsy Torup to begin conversations about how we can support our smallest congregations in collaborating together to share resources. And then finally, we have launched the URJ Marketplace, which while it's not a programmatic collaboration opportunity, it is a way to bring the power of the movement together to access resources, services, stuff like paper and technology at discounted prices. What we can't do, and what we've never been able to do, and we've been pretty consistent in saying, has been to go into a community and tell two congregations that they have to merge.
No, that's true, Amy. If I could interrupt you, if I could, you'll forgive me. But what you could do, and what leadership can do, is create rhetoric that allows us to move forward. So when Eric Yaffe, near the end of his term at a board meeting of the URJ, encouraged reforming conservative congregations to talk to each other, and Arnie Eisen echoed the same thing, that's what happened in Pittsburgh, because there was room created. And when Rick Jacobs assumed the presidency of the URJ and spoke about rearranging the architecture of synagogue life, that was rhetoric that we were able to use here to bring people together so no one saw it as waving a white flag. So I appreciate what Rabbi David Fine is doing. I love David, and I know he's busy with congregations when they contact him. What I'm looking for is some thought leadership from the movement, encouraging congregations to talk to each other. And I wonder if that will be part of Shite this year.
Yes.
Okay, good. So we're going to take one more question from Lou Barth, and then we'll tell you what's coming up next. Lou? He's trying to unmute. Lou, did you hear that you're next? Yeah, okay. He's having trouble unmuting. So while he's unmuting, let me just tell you that our next session is May 11th. Oh, there you go. There you go, Lou. Go ahead.
Okay, I just had to step out because I discovered I had a very low battery. It's one of the problems of the new world. I'm very much interested in what people are saying about what's going on in their congregations and the new issues they're facing, and yet the same old issues seem to come up all the time. So excuse me for a minute, I got to plug myself back in again.
Okay, Lou, while you're doing that, I'm going to take the opportunity to just let people know, because people are starting to leave. May 11th, we have a session at 10 a.m. There's also going to be a board meeting for any board members, and of course, everyone is invited to attend. Harry Rosenfeld, do you want to take a minute to just tell people what this session is going to be? Harry's
Sure.
our next head of programming. Go ahead,
Never
Harry.
the hell, never want me as head of development. Trust me on that one. Next month, on May 11th, as said, that'll be 11 o'clock Mountain Time for those of us not in the Pacific
I'm sorry.
time zone. But Devorah Weisberg will be speaking on "Oh Brave New World: Gender Fluidity, Transitioning, and Judaism." We live in a time when gender identity is increasingly fluid and complex. As rabbis, teachers, and family members, we are called on to understand and support people as they recognize the role that gender identity plays in their self-understanding and their relationship to others. Through the study of rabbinic texts about gender identity and respect, we will consider how to navigate these changing notions about gender and support those around us.
Great. That'll be great. And for those who said, why isn't HEC on this call? You will be able to have an HEC person to talk to. Okay, Lou, a former HEC person.
Yeah. So the word relationship came up, Hara mentioned it, and I was immediately attracted to it because everything in my life right now professionally deals with relationship. It also deals with individuals and not communities because I'm doing psychoanalytic work. The one thing that struck me was this business of, and Amy, I haven't met you before. Do we know each other? I don't think so. Anyway, was the business of, well, buildings, not buildings, all of this. These things they keep coming around all the time. I mean, I can remember conversations like this. I'm not that old, but I'm going to be older the 21st of this month. And I remember, are we putting too much money into buildings, stuff like that. So
please, and one Americano.
Please mute yourselves if you're not speaking. Somebody's not muted. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that we should try to differentiate things that are really new from things that keep coming up generation after generation. The fact that there are people who don't behave themselves is not new. I think, as I listen to it, it's not clear to me why these things are not being dealt with up front. What is it that people are afraid of? Well, there must be a basis to the fear. It seems to me that we need to deal with people's fears as to what's going to happen to them. Are they really going to lose their careers or something like that if they, mention that so-and-so made a pass at them? It doesn't make sense to me. And so I would just encourage a kind of perspective. And I know every once in a while, I used to create wonderful statements like the main reason for divorce is marriage, and the main reason and perspective distorts reality. Well, you get some perspective, you distort reality, I guess, in its own way, but if there are ways of finding out what's really new and what's not new and dealing with the fears that people have, I think that would be a very good way to go. And I love seeing all of you on the screen. And it's just a very nice way for me to reconnect. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you. And I want to thank Hara and Amy so much, not only for your wisdom and your wonderful ideas, but also for your sensitivity to the issues that are facing all of us in congregations as rabbis. So really, thank you so much. I hope you looked at the chat. There are a lot of big compliments to you. I've copied the chat so I can share those with you if you haven't seen them. So I'm going to allow you to go to do what you need to do. And the rest of us, if you want to hang out and talk, we can certainly do that because we've got this Zoom until like 3 o'clock. So anybody wants to just chat, we can do that. and I'm going to stop recording right now.